Just sign on the dotted line, Faustus, and ye shall have all thy heart desires.
No, Faustus, don't do it. You'll be damned forever.
You've got a point. Unlimited bitches. And cookies. Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, the best known work of a greatly renowned Elizabethan playwright whose career and life was cut short tragically soon. Christopher Marlowe was a contemporary of William Shakespeare, and who knows, had he lived, perhaps he would have even eclipsed the bard. We'll never know. But this is his pretty much big contribution to world literature. This is the codification of the Faustian myth. Now, I'm sure you probably already know what the myth of Faust is, but if you don't, the Faustian myth, or the myth of the Faustian bargain, is one of, if not the central myth of Western culture. It is actually grounded, surprisingly, in reality. In Germany, in circa 13 something, 1300 something, there actually was a German alchemist slash necromancer slash occultist named Johannes Faust, or Johann Faust, I can't remember exactly which, but he was a real guy, and he knew a lot of shit, and people thought that in order to gain such vast knowledge, he probably had to have sold his soul to the devil. I don't know whether there's any truth in that, but that is the basis of the myth. Faust is a very learned and educated man who grows tired and weary of mortal pursuits and sets his sights on goals that are beyond his reach, and in which, in order to attain, he must make a deal. And the Faustian deal is iconic. This is the deal with the devil, shaking hands with the devil, sign your soul away on the dotted line. And while the myth of Faust had circulated throughout Europe in chapbooks and smaller pamphlets, Christopher Marlowe's play is, as I said, basically the codification of it. This is the really the cementing of what this myth means to us today. And it's also the introduction of a lot of cliches and tropes that are probably very familiar to a lot of people, even if you don't know where they come from. So this work is actually pretty powerful still. And again, it's a shame that Christopher Marlowe's life was cut short, because this is a powerhouse work of theater, of literature, actually, just in general. And it's tragic that we didn't get to see what else he might have had up his sleeve. But such as it is, this is something of a masterpiece. It really is. It deserves its place, I believe, in the annals of world literature. And I believe it still has a lot to offer today, even though it may seem on its surface rather simplistic. So, what is the story of Faust about? Well, as I mainly just explained with the myth of Faust, there's a dude named Faust, or Faustus in the anglicized version. His name is John Faustus in this play. Although he lives in Germany, it's kind of a hodgepodge of names and cultural attributes. But anyway, he is a really smart guy. He has learned a lot. In fact, he has pretty much mastered every field of discipline available to him, but it is not enough, and he wants more. But in order to get the knowledge and the power that he so craves, he has to resort to dealings with the infernal order. So he summons the all too famous and iconic demon Mephistopheles, or in this version, Mephistopheles. It sounds like an STD, like like syphilis. Mephistopheles, and he summons him, and he's like, you know what? I want to have godlike power over the world and knowledge of all things. And if you can give it to me, you can have my soul. So so Mephistopheles is like, yeah, let me check with the big D, and I don't mean Dallas. And if he says it's good, you're on. So they set up the deal. Faustus signs away his soul in exchange for 24 years of knowledge and power and being able to basically do whatever he wants. And at the end of that time period, his soul will be dragged to hell. And he proceeds to do some stuff, although not quite as much as you might anticipate. And I think that's possibly due to the limitations of the form in which this was written. Because oddly enough, this didn't come off as quite as grand as I thought it was. It was a lot smaller in scale than I thought it would be. I mean, if I'm going to sell my soul for knowledge and power, I'm going to do some wild shit with it. And Faustus doesn't really do that. And plus, 24 years, you're willing to sell your soul for 24 years, that's it. I mean, come on, you could have at least gotten a good 30 out of it, I would think. But anyway, so this play is, as I said, it can appear rather simplistic, and I think it is rather simplistic. This is, at its base, a morality tale, basically. Basically, the gist of it: don't sell your soul, and don't have such a lust for what is beyond your reach that you will resort to doing unholy deeds in order to attain it. But despite its simplicity, there is still a lot of valuable stuff here, and a lot of stuff that I think people can apply to their lives even today. But it's also a character study, and a pretty good character study. And Faustus really does come alive in this, even though the setup of this play, the premise, is so dichotomous. This is also, I believe, the inception of the good angel and the evil angel trope. You know, you've seen it in like cartoons and stuff where whenever someone has a conflict internally, they have the little angel on the shoulder and then the devil on the other shoulder whispering in their ear. That's actually in here. Faustus is actually influenced by a good angel and an evil angel. That's what they're called in the stage directions in this, that just appear when he is at a crossroads in his life and has to make an important decision. And again, it can kind of seem a little cheesy, I suppose, especially since we've seen this kind of thing so much, but it still does have quite a bit of power to it. And the language that Christopher Marlowe employs in this play is really good. It maybe isn't quite as memorable as Shakespeare. I don't think there's quite as many notable quotations taken out of this, but he still had a way with words. And Dr. Faustus is an incredibly well written and pretty lofty work. Now, I think that as I said, it's not quite as eventful as you would think it would be, given the fact that this guy sells his soul for, you know, anything he wants, and then he proceeds to do seemingly very little with it. But again, I think that's due to the limitations of the theater of the day. I mean, this is not a novel, this is a play. This had to be practically performed on stage. And so the tricks and shenanigans that Faustus gets up to with his sidekick, his demonic sidekick Mephistopheles, are really pretty tame, honestly. But it still does serve to get the point across in that nothing is really worth your soul. That is kind of, you know, the overarching idea here. And the thing that still rings true today: nothing is worth your soul. Now, whether you take that in a literal sense or metaphorical, the result is the same. There are some things that are not worth what you have to give to achieve them. Faustus wants to be smart, he wants to have power, and he also wants to get laid. But at the end of the day, and at the end of the play, his ass gets dragged to hell, and he realizes it was not worth it. And it's powerful. It really is. And as I said, Faustus really does come alive in this play more than I was anticipating him to do, because knowing it was so, you know, simplistic in its premise, and this is a short work too. This is my edition of this play is only like 56 pages. That's pretty short. It is very sweet and to the point, and just kind of, it has the blinders on and does what it wants to do. And it utilizes a chorus in order to advance the plot and communicate changes in time and setting and whatnot. Which I don't think any of Shakespeare, or maybe not any of Shakespeare's, but most of Shakespeare's play did not rely on that. That's more of like a Greek tragedy kind of thing, like the classic Greek chorus. But speaking of Greek tragedy, it is important to note that this is a tragedy. In addition to being a morality tale, this is the downfall of a man who has within him the, just as in within all of us, the potential to do good, but yet he chooses to do evil. And this is the kernel of this play that still rings true, and I think probably always will. So the myth of Faust, as I said at the beginning, had circulated around Europe ever since the time of the actual historical Faust in Germany. But it had not achieved a level of real artistic merit until this. It was actually kind of a low, often kind of bawdy comedy, or just kind of, amateurish, kind of schlock that was performed by, like, jesters and just kind of lower uh, artists. But Christopher Marlowe took it and he saw within it these seeds for genuine human tragedy, and I think he pulled it off with great aplomb because the emotions run deep in this. But even though we condemn Faustus for what he does in this play, because I mean he sells his soul, we know exactly why he does it. And what's more, you got to ask yourself, would you do the same thing in his shoes, or would you resist? Because Faustus is kind of desperate. He has exhausted the avenues for occupation and diversion in his mortal life, and so he wants to reach beyond the mortal sphere. And so he's kind of in this anhedonic state at the beginning where he needs more, and he needs to always have more of everything, of power, of knowledge, of carnality. He always has to have more. And we always, kind of extol, at least in the Western world. And I think that's possibly why this is such a central myth in the Western world, is that we always kind of in the West have extolled the virtues of aspiration. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have a dream, you have a goal, go out there and get it. But at what cost? And this play really asks that question, and it asks it quite well. At what cost? Because Faustus pays the ultimate price at the end of this, and it is not without sympathy, because again, we understand his mindset throughout this entire play, and we understand every step that he took to reach that point. Now, if it sounds like a work of darkness and somberness, it is, but it is not without an ample amount of humor. In fact, this play was actually quite funny at times. There is a great degree of comedy in this, but not of the low kind of, it's not of what this story probably was done prior to this telling of it. The comedy extends from the premise at play in the work. That is to say, other people pick up Faustus's conjuring books, and they're like, I want to learn how to summon things too, and then it leads to disastrous results. But it is funny, but at the end of the day, it is a tragedy, and it does have moments of great gravity to it. And it is a pretty affecting work, as I said. Now, obviously, this is the basis for the more famous telling of this story, which is Goethe's Faust, which is generally regarded to be the finest work of German literature ever produced, and one which I had to read the first half of in college, and one which I plan to read in its entirety after this, so as to compare and contrast the two works, because Goethe's Faust is a whole different beast compared to this. Goethe's Faust is several hundred pages long. You can read this in an hour basically, or an hour or two. But I wanted to compare and contrast them to see how they relate and to see what carries over, because Christopher Marlowe's version, Dr. Faustus, is the basis, the primary source of inspiration for Goethe's later Faust, despite Goethe himself being actually German, and you would think having more access to like the historical source of the myth. This is kind of the groundwork of the story, and there are some things that carry over between the two, I believe, or based off what I remembered of reading Faust Part 1 in college. And I hope that Faust, the whole thing, lives up to my expectations, which are pretty high, because I mean, when you have a book that is considered the greatest work of literature that an entire country has ever produced, you kind of go into it with high expectations. But Dr. Faustus may not have shot quite as high as Goethe did with his later rendition of this tale, but it did what it set out to do, and it did it pretty well, I think. Again, this is not the most complex story that you're ever going to read. Again, it's very simplistic, but Marlowe is still able to get a lot of mileage out of the concept, and he's actually able to kind of tickle the emotions a little bit and kind of make you feel a little bit more than you might anticipate that you would. Again, it's got humor and pathos and just an abundance of all kinds of emotions, but it all culminates in what you would think it would culminate in. That is the contract coming due. And it's tragic. It is tragic. Even though Faustus, got there himself, it still hurts when we see what becomes of him, man, because he is that good of a character. And that's why I believe when I was in college, my literature teacher, my literature professor, actually told the class, I remember that, he said, if Christopher Marlowe had lived, we would not be talking about Shakespeare today. We would be talking about Christopher Marlowe. I guess he at least had that much faith in what the man would have been capable of. But such as it is, this is a masterpiece in its own right. I would give this it pretty much an A. Maybe not an A plus because I think there is a little bit more. It could have been longer because this moves at a pretty blistering pace. I don't know how long this would be if you actually saw it staged. I would be curious to do so, but I'm not sure how long it actually totals up to in like minutes when performed. But it's reading it, it goes lickety split, and so I think it could have been a little bit longer, maybe fleshed out a few more aspects, just in a little more depth. But overall, it really did hit the mark in basically every area that it wanted to. And for that reason, I think it is truly a masterpiece of world literature in its own right. So, coming off of Dr. Faustus, I'll be rolling into Goethe's Faust, I hope, in order to see how they compare and contrast, as I said. So, Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. Have you read Dr. Faustus? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. I would be greatly interested to hear your thoughts on it and whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I have said about it here today. If you have not read Dr. Faustus, you really should. It is a breezy read, but it is pretty heavy at the same time. And it's 500 years old. It's in the public domain. You can read this online. And it shouldn't take you that long, but I think there's a lot you can get out of it because the ultimate point of this book, even if you're not taking it in the literal sense like people back then did, it's still important because there are some things about yourself that you don't ever need to compromise or surrender, no matter what you stand to gain, because you will find out in the end that it was not worth it, and just as Dr. Faustus did. So, yes, and as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to like, subscribe, help the channel out a little bit. I would greatly appreciate it. And until next time, peace.